Thank you, Dr. Patterson. I'm not quite sure I can follow up quite as well, but we'll give it a shot anyhow. My name is Mike Ryan. I'm a professor of practice over at the Rawls College, and in particular, I study leadership and ethics, and that's the area I've been teaching in for the most part. And I apologize, I made a mistake in my spelling. It's not prescriptive ethics undermining ethical culture, it's proscriptive ethics undermining ethical culture in the business community. So my approach to ethics is very action-oriented. I speak to this with my students, I speak to this with other organizations I do workshops for. Ethics as an area of study is extremely interesting, but from a business perspective, until we implement something, until we follow through on something, it's simply an area of study. So my approach is very much, what are you going to do about it? So as we go through, I'd like to give you a couple definitions, if this works. There we go. Okay. The four areas I'm going to talk about are descriptive, proscriptive, prescriptive, and moral relativism. Descriptive is simply what is. And a lot of times we look at ethics and we look at the situation that currently exists. And that's a descriptive standpoint. Proscriptive is what's forbidden. It's the whole system of codes and rules and policies that are codified and that tell us what we can and what we can't do. Prescriptive is what do we want? What's the desire? What's the ideal? What ought we be doing? And then moral relativism, following up on Dr. Patterson's comment, talks about how does culture influence ethics, or what part does it play in the role of ethics? So I'm going to speak briefly to these because I only got a few minutes. But I want to follow up on it. When we talk about descriptive, that's when we hear things of, this is the way it's always done. This is the way we do it here. And right away, it's a cutoff. It limits the actions that we can take. Proscriptive goes even further. It's based on policies and rules. And it tells us what can and what can't be done. When we get into prescriptive, now all of a sudden we have to start recognizing our own obligations, our duties, our responsibilities. And it requires a much higher level of engagement. And moral relativism, as I mentioned, we have to bring in ethics and how it relates to the prevailing culture. So in terms of threats, when we talk about descriptive ethics, all of a sudden we get the responses, well, that's not my fault. That's the way it's always been done. And it's a built-in excuse. And proscriptive is not much better. It speaks to the issue of, I was following orders. This is what they said I had to do. And in fact, some of the researchers a lot of times mention that when you act, especially in business, if you act as a manager on a policy and rules and something is determined as unethical, it's not your fault, it's the fault of whoever wrote the policy and rules. That's a threat to ethics because it takes ethics away from the individual. Both of these, prescriptive and descriptive, remove the ethical component from the individual's actions. In prescriptive, we have to be engaged. Aristotle developed and went into prescriptive, and the whole concept is that we have to not only study, we have to deliberate, we have to build our cognitive awareness, and then act. That ethics without action was not of value. And when we look at moral relativism, and I put this as a threat, is some people use that to justify decisions. And it shouldn't be used to justify decisions. It should be used, as Dr. Patterson said, to grow awareness of other communities, of other perspectives. But the foundations of ethics are going to be fairly universal. Okay. So when we talk about prescriptive, one of the things that I reinforce constantly when I'm teaching is that we have to own our decisions. We can't say, well, so-and-so told us, and I don't care if that so-and-so is a professor, a preacher, a politician, it doesn't matter. We can't pass the buck. So ethics should be very personal. There's no blind acceptance. We need to investigate, we need to research, we need to develop our own thoughts on it, and not do it lightly. It requires cognitive engagement. You do have to do some study. You do have to do some research. It's not just taking things at the superficial level, and it's carrying it to the next extreme. What does it imply in terms of my obligations, my duties, to myself and to others that are involved? We talk about bounded rationality. It's the concept of we can speak to those things that we know or those things that we can learn, dependent upon time. And ethics requires that we expand our bounded rationality, requires that we seek to learn from various studies, from others, and grow that bounded rationality. And lastly, ethical decisions from a prescriptive standpoint requires that we accept the consequences. If I disagree with a law or I disagree with some policy and I act on that, I should be fully aware that I have to accept the consequences of it, because that's part of my growing as an individual, and sometimes the consequences can be severe. You might challenge a policy at work and lose your job. But if you retain your own ethical values, I don't think you've lost anything. So as we go through, I would challenge each and every one of us to constantly ask the question, are we simply doing it because somebody else said? Do we have an excuse? Or are we willing to take the extra steps and engage ourselves in the decisions that we're making? That, to me, is what ethics is fundamentally about. Thank you.